Most people think disappearing is a dramatic thing, an act of running away, a surrender. But what if the real drama isn't in leaving at all? What if it's in staying? Sitting there, smiling, replying, year after year, while the people around you quietly drain your time, your energy, and your sense of control, and you don't even notice it happening. There's a strange moment that comes to certain people after years of non-stop interaction. One day, they stop feeling truly understood. Conversations start to sound hollow. The laughter feels forced. Even the notifications on their phone start to feel less like connection and more like an intrusion. And somewhere deep inside, without knowing why, they begin to crave one thing. Not attention, not praise, distance. Machiavelli believed that real power never belongs to the person who is always seen. It belongs to the one who knows when to disappear. Because the person who exposes everything, who responds instantly, who explains themselves without end, has quietly handed the key to their own control straight into someone else's hands. And here's the uncomfortable part almost no one admits. Most people keep performing anyway. They keep replying right away. They keep maintaining relationships that died emotionally a long time ago. Not because they want to, but because they're afraid of what will surface the moment they finally go quiet. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through exactly what happens when a person disappears for a while. Not just emotionally, but in terms of power. You'll see why your silence unsettles people more than your anger ever could, and why the people who once orbited around you will never see you the same way again. But I have to warn you first. Once you see these things, you can't go back to living unconsciously. If you've ever felt exhausted from always having to be available for everyone, hit subscribe right now. Because this isn't a video you want to watch halfway. Every part that follows opens up a layer deeper than the last. And the final layer, the one about you, is the one almost no one has the courage to look at directly. Stay until the end. Number 1. The craving to vanish. At first, the idea of disappearing feels wrong, almost like guilt. Your fingers reach for the phone on instinct. You wonder if people will think you're being rude. You feel the urge to explain yourself before anyone has even asked you a single question. And that reflex, the need to apologize for your own absence before it even happens, reveals just how deeply you've been trained. Because somewhere along the way, they taught you that constant availability is the same as kindness. That replying fast means you care. That always being present makes you valuable. That disappearing is selfish. And you believed it, because almost everyone around you believed it too. But Machiavelli saw something darker underneath all this. Most people aren't really afraid of losing others. They're afraid of being forgotten. They're afraid of becoming unimportant. They're afraid of the moment their name stops coming up in someone's conversation. And it's that fear, not kindness, that keeps them available to the point of exhaustion. It turns them into the easiest pieces to move on the board. Because whoever knows what you're afraid of is already holding the string that controls you. So they keep themselves emotionally on call long after it starts to destroy their inner world. They keep up conversations that no longer bring them joy. They hold on to empty friendships. They laugh around people who are quietly draining them. And slowly, with no alarm going off anywhere, they become strangers to themselves. Think about this in concrete terms. Around this group of friends, you become softer. Around those co-workers, you become louder and more eager. Around an ex, you go quiet and guarded. Around family, you slip back into the role of the good kid you were programmed to play years ago. And after enough time, a frightening question rises up. Which one of those is actually you? Or is it none of them, and they're all just masks you wear to keep other people comfortable? Machiavelli observed this same thing among the powerful. The people loved by everyone usually held nothing real. They became mirrors reflecting everyone else's desires, until they lost their own nature completely. But the wise ones always kept a part of themselves that no one could touch. A private region, a deliberate shadow, a place that even the people closest to them were not allowed to enter. And that's exactly what the craving to disappear is trying to tell you. It isn't a sign that you're weak or negative. It's the last surviving instinct, trying to win back that shadow for you. That private space you gave away too much of, too easily, for far too many years. But to win it back, you'll have to face the first thing that silence exposes. And it isn't as pleasant as you'd expect. Number 2. Silence exposes everything. When you finally go quiet, something uncomfortable starts to happen. Not inside you, outside, where the people who claim to care about you start reacting in very strange ways. Some get irritated, some go cold, for no clear reason. Some suddenly flood you with attention again after months of silence. At first glance, you might think they miss you. But if you look closer, you'll see what's really going on. Your silence just cut off their control over how predictable you are. Machiavelli understood that people feel safe around what they can predict. A person who's always reachable is a person who's easy to manage. That's why society quietly rewards over-explaining, emotional availability, and constant presence. It calls that kindness. But what it's really naming is convenience. A kind person with no boundaries is just a convenient person to use. Because silence exposes what words always hide. It exposes the relationships that only exist because of your availability. It exposes how many people only feel connected to you while they have unlimited access to your attention. And most brutally of all, it exposes the version of yourself that you became just to be accepted. Picture a very ordinary situation. You text an old friend, they see it. 3 hours later they reply with one word, K. In the past, you'd blame yourself, wonder what you said wrong, then send another message just to fill the silence. But now, in your own quiet, you just observe. And for the first time you see a pattern clearly. A pattern. Your eyes were always too blurred by the need for approval to notice. This is why your disappearance unsettles people more than your anger ever could. Anger still gives them attention. Anger is still a form of interaction, a door left open. Silence takes all of that away, and silence pushes people into uncertainty. Suddenly they start asking themselves, did something change? Are they upset? Are they pulling away? But what really confuses them isn't your absence. It's the cold realization that your world might keep going just fine without them at the center of it. And that uncertainty reveals something most people will never admit. A lot of people aren't attached to you out of love. They're attached out of benefit and control. You give them something. A sense of safety, an audience, a shoulder, a distraction from themselves. And the moment that supply gets cut off, the true nature of the relationship rises to the surface. But that's only what other people reveal in your silence. What that silence forces you to face about yourself is much harder to swallow. Before we go on, pause for 1 second and be honest with yourself. Is there someone in your life right now who only reaches out when they need something from you? Just type the word yes in the comments. No explanation needed. Sometimes simply admitting it to yourself is the first step to taking your power back. And if this video is touching something in you, a like helps it reach other people who need to hear this too. Number 3. The withdrawal and the death of the false self. This is the point where most people run straight back toward distraction. In the first few days of silence, they return to the texts. They return to the meaningless interactions. They return to the endless stream of stimulation. Because silence, at first, is not peaceful. Silence is a confrontation, and very few people can stand it. You'll find yourself reaching for the phone with no reason at all. Wondering who noticed you were gone. Imagining conversations that never happened. Rehearsing defenses for questions no one ever asked. And that's when an unsettling truth appears. Constant contact isn't always connection. A lot of the time, it's just an addiction. Look closely at how it works. Notifications become tiny doses of reassurance, drip-fed into your brain. Every reply becomes proof that you still matter. Attention becomes emotional oxygen that you breathe in without ever realizing it. Cut off that supply suddenly, and a quiet panic rises from the inside. Not because you lost a real connection with someone, but because you lost the distraction from yourself. Machiavelli would call this the moment of testing by fire. Because underneath this, addiction is something even more important. The false self you built to survive the social game. And that false self can only live when it has an audience. That's why solitude becomes psychologically terrifying for so many people. Because when the noise disappears, there's no audience left to perform for. And with no audience, the false self begins to starve. Every day of silence is a day it grows a little weaker. And that process, though it ends in freedom, feels at first like dying. In this stage, you start to see things you couldn't see before. There are people who only reach out when they need reassurance, then vanish the moment they're full again. There are friendships built entirely on running from loneliness together, not on any real common ground. And you realize how many times you betrayed your own boundaries just to avoid disappointing someone for a single moment. Because kindness without boundaries quietly teaches people how to use you. And the saddest part is that most of them don't even realize they're doing it. People naturally drift toward whatever is emotionally most convenient, like water flowing to the lowest point. If you always listen, they'll always dump on you. If you always forgive, they'll keep crossing the line. If you always stay, they'll assume you'll never leave. Not because they're evil, but because people adapt incredibly fast to whatever is easy to access. But when the false self has starved long enough, something unexpected happens. Your mind goes still. The hunger for replies fades, and for the first time in years, you can sit in silence without needing to fill it. That's the moment your eyes get washed clean, and you start to see other people in a completely new way. Number 4. When you see other people clearly, distance does something frightening to human perception. It clears away the emotional fog. When the constant exposure disappears, when the endless conversations stop, suddenly the patterns that were hiding right in front of you begin to surface. You stop seeing people through their words. You start seeing them through how they react to your boundaries. And that's a completely different way of seeing a person. You realize who only talks to you out of boredom, who quietly competes with you while still smiling to your face, who secretly enjoys seeing you insecure because it makes them feel like they're on top. And most concerning of all, you realize how many times people punished you emotionally the moment you stopped behaving the way they expected. Not openly, quietly, a colder tone, a reply left on read on purpose, an insult disguised as a joke, a sudden emotional withdrawal designed to make you anxious enough to chase. Machiavelli said that a wise ruler has to be both the lion and the fox. The lion to be feared, so no one dares to test you. The fox to recognize the traps laid out in front of you. Because raw strength alone isn't enough, and pure innocence gets swallowed whole. The one who only knows how to roar walks straight into the net. The one who only knows how to trust gets betrayed. And here's the important thing that solitude teaches you. Everyone around you is playing the lion and the fox too, even if they'd never call it that. They test your boundaries. They fish for validation. They angle for reassurance. They try to control how they're seen. People do this constantly in every single conversation. Most of them simply don't realize they're doing it. Once you see this, ordinary conversations start to feel different. Almost surreal, because beneath the simple words, you begin to sense the quiet power negotiations happening non-stop between people. Who's seeking approval? Who's seeking dominance? Who's afraid of being abandoned, so they cling? Who's hiding resentment behind perfect politeness? You also start to understand why mysterious people make others so uncomfortable. The mind feels safe around individuals it can fully predict. The moment predictability disappears, projection begins. People invent their own explanations for your silence. He's changed. They think they're better than us now. She's acting weird. The same silence, but each person reads a completely different story into it, and that story always says more about them than it does about you. This is why disappearing changes social dynamics faster than any self-improvement effort ever could. Because people can tolerate your growth. What they can't tolerate is losing their psychological access to you. But seeing others clearly is only half of it, and it's still the easier half. Because Machiavelli warned that anyone who only sees the scheming in other people, but never sees it in themselves, is still naive. By now, you're probably picturing a few specific faces from your own life. That's the sign you're actually seeing clearly. If you want more people to be armed with this way of seeing, instead of spending their whole lives as pawns without knowing it, share this video with someone you think needs it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because the next part is the hardest one. It's the part about you, number 5. When you see yourself clearly, the most disorienting part of silence isn't what it reveals about other people. It's what it forces you to see in yourself. Because in the end, there's no one left to blame. No distractions, no constant conversations to drown out your own thoughts. Just you and the parts of yourself you spent years avoiding. Beneath the social self, beneath the carefully managed image, there's something far less pleasant waiting in the silence. The parts of yourself you buried to be accepted, your anger, your ambition, your envy, your emotional exhaustion, That desire to disappear from everyone without owing anyone a single word of explanation. Most people instantly suppress these feelings the second they rise up. They call them toxic, selfish, wrong, and quickly stamp them out. But suppression erases nothing. It just pushes everything deeper, into a place where it starts controlling your behavior indirectly, without asking permission. That's why some people suddenly explode after years of seeming gentle. Why certain individuals go emotionally numb without understanding why. Why a person wakes up one day feeling completely cut off from their own life. The rejected part was ignored for too long, and silence finally forces you to sit across from it. And here's the hardest thing to swallow. You start to realize how much of your kindness was driven by fear, not by love. How many of your relationships are kept alive only by guilt? How many traits in your personality were built just to avoid being rejected? How many times you said it's fine, while everything inside you was screaming that it was not? Machiavelli warned that anyone who only sees the scheming in others, but never in himself, is still a dangerous kind of naive. Real awareness begins the moment you realize that the psychological patterns you just condemned in others are alive inside you too. The need to be recognized, the secret wish to be admired, the quiet resentment toward people who ignored you, and even the hidden satisfaction when you disappear and watch someone scramble to find you. None of that makes you a bad person, it makes you human. And this is where a lot of people misunderstand solitude. Solitude isn't about becoming superior to everyone else. It's about seeing yourself without distortion, probably for the first time in your life. That process is painful, because the ego survives on illusion to stay comfortable. But the illusion starts to collapse in silence, and once it collapses, you understand why some people constantly surround themselves with noise. Relationships, entertainment, non-stop attention. Because if they ever truly stopped, they might meet the person hiding under the performance. And they're afraid that person might be empty, or angry, or lost. So they keep running. Most people aren't addicted to their phones. They're addicted to running from themselves. But you're not running anymore. You sat down, you looked. And now, for the first time, you're ready to do something very few people ever manage to do. Number 6. From pawn to player. After seeing other people clearly, and seeing yourself even more clearly, a cold transformation begins in the mind. You stop craving explanations from other people. The need to defend yourself fades. The urge to fix every misunderstanding disappears. Even approval starts to lose its emotional power over you. Not because you've become cold, but because you've finally seen how fragile and distorted human perception really is. To one person, your silence is arrogance. To another, it's mystery. To someone else, it's a threat. The same behavior, endless projections, and not one of those projections was ever fully in your control to begin with. Machiavelli understood that power isn't about being loved. It's about not being controlled. He argued that if you're forced to choose, it's safer to be respected than to be loved. Because love depends on someone else's will, something that can change at any moment. The person who's loved lives in constant fear of losing that affection, so they please, they concede, and they lose themselves bit by bit. But the person who's respected for their steadiness never has to beg for anything. And this is what unsettles the people used to controlling you the most. Unpredictability is a form of power. The moment they can no longer predict your reactions, your emotions, or your availability, tension appears. Because control feeds on predictability, that's why silence unsettles manipulators more than a direct confrontation ever could. Confrontation still gives them access to your emotions. Silence slams the door shut without explaining why. And people struggle enormously with doors they can't reopen. Here's where Machiavelli's deepest idea comes through. He believed that fate, what he called fortuna, controls only half of a person's life. The other half belongs to those bold enough to act through their own ability and will, what he called virtue. But most people hand their entire lives over to the current. They repeat the same emotional cycles over and over without ever recognizing them, and then they call it destiny. The person who always chases people who won't reach back. The person who confuses being needed with being loved. The person who keeps sacrificing themselves, hoping loyalty will eventually be repaid. That isn't destiny, that's a pattern. And you can break it, but only after you've seen it first, which is exactly what you just did in the silence. Machiavelli understood that to shape your own fate, you have to separate yourself from the crowd's expectations. Which means at some point, you have to disappoint people. You have to become less available, less easy to explain, less eager to maintain every relationship. And some people will resent you for it. Not because you harmed them, but because your transformation forces them to face their own stagnation. Remember this carefully. People don't resent your boundaries. They resent the version of themselves your boundaries accidentally expose. This is where real power gets forged. Not in rooms full of people cheering for you, but in the stillness where you learn to stand firm without any audience at all. Because the person who needs a crowd to feel like they exist will always be a prisoner of that crowd. But the person who can sit alone without falling apart already owns a kind of power no one can take away. You master yourself first, and only then can you master your circumstances. That's an order Machiavelli would never reverse. In the end, you come back, no drama. Most people don't even notice the exact moment it happens. But you notice, because something inside you no longer moves the way it used to. The old hunger for constant connection has faded. You stop needing every message answered instantly. You stop feeling responsible for keeping every relationship in the world alive. And for the first time, you understand the difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is the pain of not being seen. Solitude is the peace of seeing yourself clearly. Most people spend their whole lives afraid of silence, because silence takes the witnesses away from their identity, and without witnesses, they no longer know who they are. When you come back, the relationships rearrange themselves. The person who only called when they needed comfort slowly disappears. The ones who claimed to care suddenly stop reaching out. But the people who truly value you stay, quietly, without demanding constant proof of your availability. And you come to understand that a lot of people who say they miss you are really saying they miss their access to the feeling you used to give them. There's a difference there, a painful difference, but an important one. You no longer romanticize human connection blindly. But paradoxically, you treasure the real connections more than ever. You walk out of that silence, not as someone running from the world, but as someone who finally sees the rules of the game. You're not a pawn being pushed around anymore. You've become the one watching the board, and once you see the board, you can never play the same way again. Sometimes the wisest thing you can do is quietly disappear long enough to hear your own mind again. Because if you never separate yourself from the noise, you can spend your entire life confusing who you really are with who the world rewarded you for becoming. If you made it all the way here, I believe something in this video reached exactly the place you needed it to. So do this, comment the word disappear if you've ever felt the need to vanish from everyone, just to hear the sound of your own mind again. Leave a like so the algorithm carries this message to the people out there suffering in silence. And subscribe, because the journey of mastering yourself is only just beginning. I'll see you in the next stillness.